There is a place in West Virginia where time stopped working correctly, where the roads stop having names, where the census takers stop trying, where neighbors can tell you about a family that has lived on the same land for over 100 years, and in all that time, no one has ever really left, not by choice. The Whittakers of Odd, West Virginia, are, by almost every account, the most severely inbred family in the United States. Photographs taken of them in the early 2000s shocked the internet. The images look wrong. Not just medically wrong, wrong in a way that reaches into something older, something that the rational mind struggles to categorize. Slack faces, vacant eyes that seem to occupy the skull at slightly misaligned angles, mouths that hang open and emit sounds that are not quite language, bodies that move like they are receiving delayed instructions from somewhere far away. The mainstream explanation is genetics. Inbreeding, Appalachian poverty and isolation. Consanguinity collapsed over generations into biological catastrophe, and that explanation is not wrong, but it is not complete. Because there is something the documentarians who visit Odd, West Virginia, always choose to leave out of the frame, something the cameras pan away from, something the locals mention only in lowered voices, and only to people they already trust, and only after dark. The Whittakers did not begin this way. There was a moment, a specific, documented moment, when the family's trajectory changed. When the patriarch, a man whose name appears in records as Calvin Whittaker, made a decision that no man in that valley had made before him, and when he later tried to escape the consequences of that decision, what happened next does not appear in any official record, because what happened next cannot be recorded in the language of the civilization we think we live in. To understand what the Whittakers actually are, what their bloodline was designed to preserve, and what it was designed to protect against, you have to go back much further than West Virginia. You have to go back further than America, further than the European settlers who pushed into Appalachian hollows and decided to stop moving, further than the trade routes and the conquest and the great forgetting. You have to go back to Tartaria. Not the Tartaria of Reddit threads and YouTube thumbnails. Not the Tartaria of mud floods and reset civilizations and star forts, though all of those things are relevant and none of them are accidental. The real Tartaria. The civilization that existed before the one we were handed. The civilization that built in a different language, not English or Latin or Greek, but a structural language, an architectural language, a biological language that encoded information not in books, which can be burned, but in bloodlines, which cannot. The Tartarian archive was not made of paper. It was made of people. And some of those people ended up in Appalachian hollows in West Virginia, and they were told by someone at some point to stay there, to not leave, to keep the line unbroken, and to do whatever was necessary to ensure that the information encoded in their blood did not dilute into the general population before the time came to read it. Calvin Whittaker knew this. And when he forgot, when the rational, civilized mind that the post-reset world had built around him asserted itself, and he tried to walk away from what he had made, the family ensured he did not get far. What they did to him when they caught him is, by every available account, not something a modern Western mind has the framework to evaluate morally. But the Tartarian archive does not operate within the moral framework of the civilization that replaced it. It operates within the logic of preservation, and preservation has no mercy. The story of the Whittaker family begins, in the documentary record, with a man named Colt Whittaker, a younger relative who, in the early 2000s, served as the first point of contact for the outside world. Colt was functional in ways that his siblings and cousins were not. He could speak, he could negotiate. He stood at the edge of the family's property and served as a kind of translator between whatever was happening inside that compound and the rest of West Virginia. The documentarian Mark Later reached the Whittakers through Colt. His photographs, taken in 2004 and not published until years later because no editor would run them, became the images that eventually circulated online and created the small cultural phenomenon we now associate with the Whittaker name. Later documented what he saw with the clinical detachment of a photojournalist, a woman crawling in the dirt, a man with eyes that appeared to be rotated slightly in their sockets, children sitting in configurations that did not suggest play or rest, but something else, something that had no name in the English language. He asked about the family's history. The answers were incomplete. There had been a grandfather, or possibly a great-grandfather, who had married his own sister, or possibly his daughter. The accounts varied. The family did not maintain clear distinctions between these categories. What was consistent across every account, every interview, every conversation with odd locals, every fragment of documentary evidence, was the presence of an older authority. Not a person, exactly. A principle, a rule, something that the family understood to govern their behavior in a way that preceded any living memory of when the rule had been established or by whom. The rule was, the line does not leave. No one could say where this rule came from. The evangelical Christianity that saturated the surrounding culture had been layered over it, but it preceded that layer. The poverty and isolation that provided the cover story had been layered over it, but it preceded that layer too. The rule was older than any living Whittaker could remember, and the Whittakers were not the only poor and isolated family in that valley. They were not the only ones who had limited education and limited access to the outside world. They were the only ones living like this, which means the external conditions do not explain it. Something internal does. Tartaria is the word that the post-reset civilization uses, usually disparagingly, to describe the idea that there was a global civilization before the one we were handed. A civilization that built at a scale and with a sophistication that the official historical timeline cannot account for. The star forts. The cathedrals with their impossible precision. The identical neoclassical architecture appearing simultaneously across continents that supposedly had no contact with each other. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century, at which full cities of enormous buildings appeared fully formed, and were then, officially, demolished, though the demolition records are inconsistent, and the photographs of the demolitions do not always match what was supposedly destroyed. The mud flood theory holds that a catastrophic event, possibly multiple events, buried the lower floors of Tartarian buildings across the world, leaving only the upper stories visible. This is why so many old buildings have their grandest windows and most elaborate architectural detail at what appears to be the ground floor, because the ground floor, once, was not the ground floor. The real foundations are still there, below the mud, below the fill, waiting. The reset theory holds that the civilization that replaced Tartaria was not an evolution. It was an installation, a managed replacement. A civilization inserted into the space where another civilization had been, with a new origin story, new languages, new institutions, and, critically, new populations. Populations that had been separated, over generations, from the knowledge that the previous civilization had embedded in the fabric of reality around them. What the reset did not account for was the biological archive. Because the Tartarian system understood something that our civilization has lost almost entirely, that the most durable information storage medium in existence is not stone, which can be quarried and repurposed, and not metal, which can be melted and recast, and not paper, which can be burned. The most durable information storage medium is a human bloodline, maintained with sufficient genetic consistency over sufficient time under sufficient isolation to preserve whatever was encoded in it. This is not metaphor. This is not spiritualism. Epigenetic memory, the inheritance of traits and responses and capacities acquired by ancestors, is now accepted in mainstream science, though its implications are carefully not discussed in mainstream contexts. The idea that specific sequences of experience and initiation can be written into the germline and passed forward without being written anywhere else, that the body is a library, and the stacks go back much further than the living mind can consciously access. This is not fringe biology. It is the biology the Tartarian archive was built on, and the Whittakers of Odd, West Virginia, are, in this framework, not a tragedy. They are a vault. The Tartarian buildings that survive the ones that were not fully buried or repurposed share a set of architectural features that are not aesthetic choices. The domes, the spires, the specific ratios of height to width, the placement relative to ley lines and water tables and geological formations that modern architecture ignores entirely. These features are functional. They are antennae. They are resonators. They are designed to interact with a frequency field that the post-reset civilization does not officially acknowledge, but that the Tartarian civilization understood as the foundational medium through which biological information, including the information encoded in human bloodlines, could be activated, read, and transmitted. The architecture was And the activation of any given bloodline required a condition that the Tartarian system had discovered, and that the post-reset system has spent considerable effort suppressing: genetic coherence. A bloodline that had not been diluted. A line that had been kept, in the most literal sense, pure. Not pure in the racial sense, pure in the informational sense. Coherent, uncompromised. The way a signal needs to be coherent to carry meaningful data, and the way interference destroys that coherence and renders the data inaccessible. The Whittaker family was assigned the role of a closed vault, because whatever is encoded in their bloodline was deemed important enough to preserve at any cost, including the cost visible in every photograph Mark later ever took of them. The physical degradation, the neurological dysfunction, the apparent cognitive limitation, the faces that do not arrange themselves into the expressions a modern viewer expects, these are not the intended state. They are the cost of operating without the activating frequency. A vault that cannot be opened still performs its primary function, which is preservation. It does not need to perform optimally. It does not need to be beautiful or functional in the ways the civilization around it considers normal. It needs to hold, and the Whittakers have held, for generations beyond what any purely sociological explanation can account for. The story of Calvin Whittaker, the patriarch who understood enough of what the family was to make the decision he made, and who later tried to unmake it, requires care in the telling, because the documentary record is fragmentary. What the fragments agree on is this: Calvin was not an unintelligent man. He was functional. He had working relationships with people outside the family. He understood the rules of the civilization around him well enough to navigate its edges. He knew what the family was. He knew, in the way that the head of a vault knows what is inside it, what was being preserved, and why the preservation required the methods it required. He made a decision to continue those methods under his authority and by his active participation. The children that resulted are what Mark later photographed 50 years later. They are what the internet recoiled from. They are what every journalist who visits West Virginia describes in terms that reach for clinical distance and never quite achieve it, because the clinical distance that modernity offers as a tool for processing things like this is not adequate. It was not designed to be adequate. It was designed to keep the observer from asking the question that the sight of the Whittakers actually provokes, which is not what is wrong with them, but what are they for? What Calvin Whittaker tried to escape was not the family. It was not even the decision he had made. What he tried to escape was the thing he had felt in the years after the decision, moving in the bloodline. The thing that the genetic coherence he had ensured was beginning to allow access to. He felt it in the children, in the way they moved, in the sounds they made that were not language but were not random sounds that had a grammar, a structure, a consistency across individuals who could not have coordinated their production. Sounds that seemed, on certain nights, to be responsive to something that was not present in any form he could perceive, but that he could feel. Calvin Whittaker was not a man who had the vocabulary for what he experienced. He did not have the Tartarian framework. He did not know about frequency architecture, or epigenetic memory, or the activation conditions his decision had begun to satisfy. He knew only that something was waking up in the hollow, and he was afraid of it. And one morning, he left. He took the one road that leads out of West Virginia, past the houses of people who had watched his family for generations, past the general store where the owner knew not to ask questions, past the limits of whatever territory the family had always understood to be theirs. He got perhaps 3 miles. The Whittakers, who were functional enough to pursue him, and there were those who were functional enough for this specific purpose, even when they appeared functional for little else, brought him back. What they communicated to him, in whatever system they operated within, was not a threat. It was not a punishment. It was a reminder. The line does not leave. The vault does not open from the inside. The archive does not get to decide when it has been kept long enough. Calvin Whittaker did not try to leave again. He lived out the remaining years of his life in the hollow. He did not, by any account, appear to suffer in the conventional sense. He appeared to have reached some kind of accommodation with what he had felt waking up around him. The peace of a man who has stopped fighting a tide and learned, instead, to float. The children he had made were the vault. He was the key, and keys do not leave. What the Whittaker story reveals, when read through the Tartarian framework, is a specific technology of preservation that operated across the post-reset period, a period that the physical evidence suggests extends back much further than the official timeline allows. The technology works like this. A lineage carrying significant Tartarian biological encoding is placed in a location that provides sufficient isolation to maintain genetic coherence over the required generations. A custodial structure is established that does not require the members of the lineage to understand what they are preserving or why. The rule is simplified to its most durable form. The line does not leave. This rule is encoded not in written law or conscious belief, but in behavior so deeply habituated that it persists without anyone being able to explain why it exists. The degradation that occurs over generations of tight consanguinity is accepted as a cost. It is in fact partly functional. A family that appears severely dysfunctional is left alone by the civilization around it. It does not attract the kind of attention that would lead to intervention, to dispersal, to the very dilution it exists to prevent. The appearance of damage is a form of camouflage. The Whittakers, on the surface, look like a cautionary tale. Every journalist who visits them frames the story this way. But the whole story is that something is being kept in that hollow in West Virginia that the civilization we live in does not have the language to name. Something encoded, in the biological sense, by a civilization that understood the human body as an archive, and understood isolation as a preservation technique, and understood the maintenance of that archive as worth any cost. The Tartarian builders did not leave their most important work in stone. The sounds that the non-verbal members of the family make, which every documentarian notes and none fully transcribes, have been described variously as animalistic, as distressing, as uncanny. What they have not been described as, because the describer does not have the framework, is musical. But they are musical. They have intervals. They have repetition patterns. They have a relationship to each other across individuals that is not random and is not the result of imitation, because the individuals making them cannot imitate in the ordinary sense. They are producing something. The movements of the family members who appear most severely affected the ones who do not interact with visitors, who are glimpsed at the edges of photographs, who are described as feral by observers who cannot find a more precise word, are not random either. They orient. They respond to things that are not visible in the frame. The few aerial photographs that exist suggest they arrange themselves, at certain times, in spatial patterns that are not accidental. The vault is not inert. Something in it is still running, still waiting for the frequency that will allow it to fully express what it has been holding across all the generations of damage and cost and isolation since the civilization that made it went underground. The Tartarian researchers who take the biological archive theory seriously point to a specific prediction that the cyclical model generates. The frequency architecture of the planet shifts with cycles. The shift that Tartarian astronomical work pointed toward the one their architecture was calibrated to prepare for, that their biological archives were established to survive through, is not a past event. It is an approaching one. The cycle is not ending. It is returning. And when it returns, the vaults will not need to be opened from the outside. They will open themselves. The Whittaker family continues to exist in odd West Virginia. They have been visited by documentarians, by internet personalities, by journalists looking for content. Almost all of them leave with the same surface story. A family destroyed by inbreeding, by poverty, by isolation, by a social system that failed to intervene before the damage was irrevocable. Almost none of them leave with the deeper story. The deeper story requires the willingness to look at what the Whittakers are doing, what they have been doing, consistently, across documented generations, and to ask not what went wrong, but what is being maintained. Calvin Whittaker felt it waking. he ran from it. The family brought him back. And in doing so, in enforcing the rule that has no rational explanation and no modern moral defense, they ensured that whatever is in that bloodline is still there, still intact, still waiting. The civilization that built the Tartarian archive knew something that the civilization we live in has tried very hard to make unknowable, that the most important things are not the ones that can be said. They are the ones that can be carried through time, through catastrophe, through the managed forgetting of a reset that tried to sever the present from the past so completely that no one would ever think to ask what had been lost. The Whittakers of Odd, West Virginia, are what it looks like when the answer to that question is preserved in the only medium that cannot be confiscated. Not a cautionary tale, not a tragedy, a door, still closed, still waiting for the key.